Hello, and welcome to this MuStE Talk entitled Why Should I Study Historical Linguistics? My name is María-José Esteve Ramos, and I work at Universitat Jaume I, although I am currently visiting the University of Glasgow. I have been a member of MuStE for many years, so I know UGC quite well. In Castelló, I teach Old and Middle English and also diachronic linguistics, and one of the first things we deal with in class is to ask ourselves, why are we studying this? Why is it so important to know about the past? And of course my answer is yes, it is so important that we cannot master a language completely unless we know about its history. Today, I will give you a few hints of what the discipline may cover and why this can become the most fascinating journey of your professional life, as it has happened for me and for the rest of the members of the MuStE team. Let us begin. Our little talk today is divided into 4 different sections. Number 1, what is historical linguistics and what are the main objectives of this discipline? Number 2, change is the basic notion to understand the evolution of a language and the reasons for these changes. Number 3, as language changes, it evolves into different stages that we classify as groups of languages, and we call them families. The mother of most of the languages spoken in our current Europe is called Indo-European, and the study of the origin and evolution of languages also receives the name of Indo-European linguistics. Number 4, the final section is meant to show briefly a few samples of how English was in each of its different periods. What is historical linguistics? Essentially, it studies how languages change through time. Basically, we can study any aspect of linguistics, and of course we can apply different methods and perspective used to study the current stage of any language. And we can also apply this to historical material, just as we are doing with the Coruña Corpus project, which uses corpus linguistics to study the language of the 18th and the 19th century. Another specific interest within historical linguistics is the study of the origin of words, what we called etymology. Now that I am in Glasgow, I can tell you, for example, that this name comes from Glasgow, meaning Green Deer Valley. Isn't this interesting? And finally, another area that we have already mentioned is Indo-European linguistics. It deals with the origin and development of languages, and it is a fascinating subject. In brief, what is the impact of studying historical linguistics? The benefits are many. I would say it is absolutely essential. It helps to explain the current irregularities of the language. Why do we have the mismatch between spelling and pronunciation? Why the irregular verbs? Why the possessive S, or Anglo-Saxon genitive as they used to call it in my time? Also, the benefit of gaining insight into cultural history and to know which communities have been shaping the language and in which contexts. All this provides students with an awareness of the linguistic behavior of English like no other subject can. The second section of the talk is about introducing you to the idea of why languages change. This question has not a clear and definitive answer, and all we can do is to observe and try to understand the processes involved. We all know the natural language change, and because they change, they have a history. And languages change in different ways. So we can say that the history of English is the record of how one dialect of West Germanic has changed over the past 1500 years. As to the reasons, we may encounter different types of explanations provided by different schools in linguistics. The principle of least effort, exemplified with going, are evolving into gonna. Analogy, this is imitating or copying another form, and so that it triggers a change. the word delight was not spelled with GH, but by analogy with light, ended up with that spelling. Other theories explain language change, like for example imperfect learning proposed by the field of language acquisition, and other theories such as Keller's invisible hand resort to different explanation of this phenomenon. In discussing the history of the language, we have another distinction that proves very useful, and this is the distinction between external causes for a change and internal causes. In the case of external causes, we may refer to events happening to the speakers of a given language causing changes in that same language, like for example the one you see in the slide. We have an Old English word which was pronounced whose, and we recognize this word as our present day house. Now, I want to refer to the change in spelling. The word in Old English whose was spelled, as you can see, with U, and the pronunciation was a long U. Now, when the French, the Normans, conquered England, as we will see later, they will hear the word, but they will use their own spelling. So the spelling for long U in French is OU. So basically they repressed it, and we have the present day spelling for house. Now, this is an external event, a historical event, the conquest of the Normans, having an impact into the language, and this is what we call an external influence. Internal influences are changes in one system of the language which impinge on another system, like for example the Old English declensions. They started to fall at the end of the period, and some of the reasons were that the few declension endings were similar, some were the same, and also they were the same and they coincided with some of the endings in the Old Norse language. So altogether it impinged the change, and it provided that the declensions in Old English started to fall. And this hasn't been caused by any external event. It's something that is within the evolution of the language itself. Summarizing, we studied the evolution of languages, in this case English, and both external and internal factors should be accounted for. Different periods are named to understand the different stages of English, and we finally aim at understanding the change in English and its varieties through the study of its different parts: morphology, phonology, and syntax. We must not forget, though, that context and other social-linguistic and pragmatic aspects are also the object of interest for many historical linguists, and they can be essential to the understanding of linguistic variation. Now, let's move to section 3. We are halfway now. Well done. If you continue bearing with me, I will lead you to this last part of the talk, full of exciting things. As I said earlier, Indo-European linguistics seeks to explain the origin of languages and how they relate to each other. You see the image of a tree in the slide. This is the most common way of representing these relationships, although there are others. Again, the idea of the tree and how this concept represents the way languages are related is here. This quotation summarizes very well what I have been trying to explain, and I quote, "The English language should be realized is not a wayside tree that has grown up wild. It is rather a highly cultivated plant which has been crossbred with other languages, which has for centuries been grafted and pruned, and which has been forced in its growth and the processes employed in its development deserve to be more widely known." End of quote. Now, where and when did our languages begin to be spoken? Who? How? All these are very intriguing questions. The hypothesis is that originally all of them came from one we call Indo-European. But whether all languages were once one, we cannot fully confirm. As we are dealing with periods of language with no written records and no evidence at all, we call them Proto-Indo-European, referring to the fact it is all hypothetical. However, coincidences are so obvious that we can quite safely think that they are related. Like, for example, like you see in the slide, blue, blau, bleu, Tochter in German and daughter in English, sun and Sonne or fly and fliegen. So they have these so very striking similarities. So they must be family. They must be related. Such a clearly related group is normally called a language family, and its members are cognate languages, a word that comes from Latin cognatus, born together, related by birth. To end these brief sections, let us have a look at the famous tree. You can't see the base, which is Indo-European. Then there are big branches. One of them is the European, divided in smaller branches, from which we recognize the most familiar to us, Romance and Germanic. And we can see English belonging to the West Germanic group. Okay, so here we come to the last part of the talk. We're now going to see some of the real thing. English is divided into 4 periods. The first one is Old English, the 5th to the 11th century, followed by Middle English, 12th to the 16th century roughly, and the so-called Modern period, which is divided into Early Modern and Late Modern. Present-day English, or Contemporary English, begins in the 1900s, the 20th century. Each of these periods are defined by having its own phonological, morphological, and syntactic features, as well as a distinctive historical context. It must be said that language does not simply change from one period to another. One does not speak Old English in 1100 and then on the next day speaks Middle English. There are what we call transitional periods in which language reflects characteristics of both. The first period is Old English. Old English arrives to Britain in the 5th century with the Germanic invasions. In this period, the language brought by the Anglo-Saxons will also have the influence of Latin, the Celtic language, and Old Norse, the language of the Vikings. Please look at how different it is from our contemporary English. On the left, we have a manuscript of one of the most important works in Old English, the epic poem Beowulf. Then you can see the transcription in the middle and the translation on the right. How exciting is this? It is quite so much as time travel. We are in contact with this period through the study of this object and its content. Let's read the first 3 lines. Huet we garden an year dagum, theod kuningum thrin jefrunen, who that ethlingas ellen fremeden. Now that sounds quite different from contemporary English, doesn't it? The translation goes, so the spear danes in days go by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. Isn't this interesting? Let's see what happens next. Here we have moved on to Middle English. At this time, a very important thing happened that was going to affect the language drastically: the invasion of the Normans. Why was so dramatic? Because they spoke French, and for centuries this is going to become the prestige language, and its influence on English is going to be very strong. Imagine around 10,000 words from French entered the language in that period, transforming the early Anglo-Saxon forever. Let us look at the slide. On the left, a manuscript containing some line of the very famous work, The Canterbury Tales, by Geoffrey Chaucer. In this case, you can clearly see how the changes from Old English, and everything is now much clearer. Let's read the first 4 lines. When that April with the sure soorte, de droogte of March hath pierced to the roote, and baited every vein in sweet liquor, of which virtue and grandeur is the floor. And that goes to be translated as when April with its sweet-smelling showers have pierced the drought of March to the root, and bathed every vein of the plant in such liquid, by which power the flower is created. So now we can start to understand much more than we did with Old English, don't we? But still, it's quite different from contemporary English. Wonderful. Let's see what comes next. The Time of Shakespeare. Can you recognize this work? Hamlet. Yes, of course. One of my favorites. And can you see what else is different? Yes, this is not manuscript. This is a printed book. So we are not only in a new stage of the language, but in a new moment of history. And thanks to the printing press brought to Britain by Caxton, books look like this. Let us read the first 4 lines. Stand. Who is that? 'Tis I. Oh, you cannot count carefully with who you watch. If you meet Marcellus and Horatio, the partners of my watch, bid them make haste. As you can see, some of the difficulties of the past stages are not there anymore, but we still can identify some letters which have now disappeared, like the long S in the word haste. A very interesting period and a very interesting author. Shakespeare is not only famous for his literary works, he also contributed to the English language with a good number of new words. Now, let's see how this story continues. Finally, we are in the period called Late Modern English, a fascinating period. This is the time of enlightenment, the time of reason, the time of science, and the time for expansion. From the British Isles, many will travel to America, Australia, and explore many unknown corners of the world. Let's work at this text from 1711, printed precisely in Glasgow by Thomas Crawford, and as you can read at the bottom of the text, sold at his shop at little above the cross. Again, look at that long S just in Hamlet. The text shows clearly a persuasive function. Let's read it. An account of terrible apparitions and prodigies which had been seen both upon earth and sea in the end of last and beginning of this present year, 1721. This is Don't Go. It's full of monsters. This is really persuasive. And to this end, we can not only study the language, but also other aspects such as the typography. Look at how the words apparitions and prodigies are printed. Isn't that interesting? So this is how the text continues. And you can observe again other special characters like after prodigies, and more examples with long S, like in the first line, assign, cause, etc. Now, just to end with this section, there's a very interesting text about a witness who was at the time of the French Revolution and wrote about it. We can analyze many things. Again, we will find the presence of special characters like the long S or the CT ligature, and also other things that we can observe, like the use of the adjectives to actually make the reader believe that this is an authentic witness, that this is an authentic tale. True, authentic, and particular account of the trial and condemnation of the Queen of France, with a genuine account of her behavior. Okay, so that the reader knows that the person who's telling the story has actually been there. A very interesting text, 1793. And we now reach the end of a very short journey. And again, I would like to emphasize the benefits of studying historical linguistics. It is beneficial because it helps us to understand the irregularities of the language. It helps us to create awareness, to reflect on the processes of change. It helps us to engage in the cultural history of the language and to explore the historical context, the society, and the people forming a particular community of speakers in past stages of the language. It helps us to have a deeper knowledge of the linguistic processes involved in the historical development of a language, which will be very beneficial for understanding contemporary English. I hope that some of the enthusiasm I feel for this subject may have sparked a little interest. Thank you very much for listening today. Goodbye, and see you in the next MuStE Talk.